My name is Mike Savage. I'm one of the directors of the IAI and I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology here. We have a regular group of seminars, mostly every fortnight. Please do come along. Mixture. We have quite a lot of internal seminars given by people we've given small grants to. So it's a chance for you to see the kind of research which we're supporting at the IAI over the coming year. And we're going to start off with a really great talk, which I've seen develop over the last few months. The decline and persistence of the old boy, private schools and elite recruitment, 1897 to 2016. 4 authors are listed here. 2 of them will be speaking. Sam Friedman, who's Associate Professor in the Sociology Department, and Aaron Reeves, who's Associate Professor or Research Fellow in the IAI. So it's great to see a teaming up of the Sociology Department and the IAI. The plan is they're going to do a double act between them for about 45 minutes, and then that should leave about half an hour for discussion. So, no further ado, on to Sam.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you all for coming. So our talk today, which is very much a team effort, I should say, is entitled The Decline and Persistence of the Old Boy. And really this looks at the role of schools in recruitment to the British elite over the last 120 years. Now, the expansion of education throughout the 20th century was supposed to create more equal societies where everyone had the same opportunities, irrespective of who their parents were, or more importantly for our purposes today, the school that they attended. But a large body of research, I think, now offers a pretty sobering corrective to this lofty ideal. Scholars across many countries have found that while educational expansion may well have reduced inequalities in educational attainment, it's largely failed to equalise opportunities in the labour market, failed to boost social mobility. But I think one limitation of this work, for us anyway, is that it tends to look at rather broad categories of a person's destination in life, their broad occupational class position, rather than examining access to more specific destinations such as the elite. And this is important because educational reforms may well have been especially significant for elites, as they have traditionally been associated with particular educational pathways that may themselves have been directly affected by the democratisation of schooling. For example, elites in the UK, in the US, Canada, Japan, France, have all traditionally had ties, very strong ties, to a set of small private secondary schools that have acted as key elite training grounds. So here a classical academic curriculum, distinct extracurricular activities, and a boarding school structure have all combined to create a sort of unmistakable educational experience that has then sort of signalled elite status to occupational gatekeepers. But as we want to explore here, educational reform may have had 2 important ramifications for this signalling power of elite schools. First, it may simply have increased the pool of candidates able to actually compete for elite positions. And secondly, in most cases, it introduced a set of standardised academic credentials that were intended to actually level the academic playing field. Now, we think the UK is an ideal context to interrogate these issues. Not only does it have a history of quite radical educational reforms, but it also possesses a centuries-old legacy of elite private secondary schools, particularly the 9 male-only schools shown here, collectively known as the Clarendon Schools. Now, these schools are not just old, they're not just expensive, they don't just have silly dress codes, but they also carry a remarkable historical legacy for incubating future male leaders. Just to give you one stat in this vein, of the 54 prime ministers elected to office in the UK, 67% of those attended one of these 9 schools. Okay, even though collectively these schools educate just over 0.1% of the UK population. But while these schools clearly continue to confer some advantage, the degree to which they're able to propel their old boys into specifically elite destinations, and how this may have changed over time, is largely unknown. To borrow the words of Honey here, do the Clarendon Schools remain the chief nurseries of the British elite? This is really the first question that we want to tackle today. And to do so, we want to draw on what we think is a truly unique data source. 120 years of biographical data contained within WhosWho, which is an unrivaled catalogue of the British elite, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a while. Specifically, we want to use WhosWho to explore the degree to which Clarendon Schools, along with a wider group of about 200 other public schools, have remained pivotal to elite recruitment in the UK. We then want to go a step further. We want to examine also the institutional channels, through which these schools may or may not have propelled their alumni. To what extent does their propulsive power rely on providing their old boys with entry to other, possibly more decisive elite institutions? And here we're going to examine three pathways in particular. I think arguably the most established channel connecting elite schools with elite destinations is the intermediary of a prestigious university. Here we examine this via the link between Clarendon Schools and the elite universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Now, historically, not only have Oxbridge admission procedures strongly advantaged old boys, either through quite explicit sponsor relationships in the past or by privileging academic or sporting activities that are actually only practiced in these elite schools, but I think elite universities also act as distinct hubs, where old boys can augment networks, worldviews that they may have originally established at school. I suppose the most infamous example of this is, of course, Oxford's Bullingdon Club, where public school boys, some of whom you may recognise, came together to eat, to drink, and generally to act disgracefully. And I think this hub function of elite universities was very neatly captured by C. Wright Mills, who famously remarked in a US context that there are two Harvards, one for a closely networked set of old boys and one for everyone else. Similarly, the force of elite schools has also been attributed in the past to their links with private members' clubs. In a UK context, such clubs, particularly ones like this in Pall Mall, the Athenaeum, synonymous with elite academics, incidentally, have been strongly associated with what's called a folk concept of an old boys network. And the idea, of course, here is that the sort of institutional apparatus of a club provides a closed setting in which homophily, again established at school, can then be converted into actually much more tangible forms of social capital, particularly in terms of advancing elite careers. And finally, it may be that elite schools actually provide unmediated access to elite pathways, that they deliver actually quite direct resources that are long-lasting and that continue to oil trajectories throughout life. For example, they're thought to be quite strong secondary sources of socialization, inculcating what Bourdieu has termed embodied cultural capital. So highly valuable dispositions manifest in vocabulary, in inflection, in styles of dress, aesthetic taste, values, manners, and often historically imagined in the physical and aesthetic dimensions of the gentleman. And mastery of this sort of understated, cultured, gentlemanly disposition in turn has then long been considered a key way that you signal your elite status in Britain. So I suppose in sum, sociological and historical literature has pointed to all of these channels as potential routes through which old boys move forward from elite schools. But the reality is actually we have no empirical data, or none that we know of anyway, that can actually help adjudicate the power of these different pathways. So here again, WhosWho offers a unique opportunity. It provides data not just on the specific schools attended by entrants, but also the particular universities that they attended and the clubs they are members of, and therefore allows us to examine the extent to which these schools deliver elite destinations via or independent of other institutions. Just before I hand over to Aaron to take you through our analysis, I just want to explain a little bit more about WhosWho as a data source, because I think this is important in terms of the question of what we mean by elites, or what we mean by the elite in this context. So, as all of you probably know, there has been a recent, very much of a revival of interest in elites, particularly in the wake of Piketty's groundbreaking work. But I think this strand of work tends to be dominated by economic definitions of elites. The 1%, the super rich, high net worth individuals. And they tend to ignore the importance of elites that actually operate in fields where the command of resources is not necessarily always or only economic. WhosWho, I suppose, in contrast then, which calls itself a dictionary of noteworthy and influential people, and has been published, as I say, every year for the last 120, allows us, we think, to draw on a wider conception of elites. Now, primarily, WhosWho documents what might be termed a positional elite, in the sense that around 50% of its entrants are included automatically upon reaching a prominent occupational position. So, members of parliament, peers, judges, ambassadors, FTSE 100 CEOs, poet laureates, fellows of the British Academy, among many others, are all included by virtue of their office. The other 50% are selected by a board of advisors. Now, this part of the process has been long shrouded in mystery. So to get further clarity, we interviewed Katie McAdam, who's head of yearbooks at Bloomsbury, and is involved in the coordination of this selection process. And she explained very clearly to us that the process of selecting entrants in this way is not influenced by politicking. Entries cannot be purchased. Instead, a long list tends to be drawn up based on individuals who have achieved a sort of noteworthy professional appointment in recent times, or who the board of advisors feel have had a sustained influence on British society. And then the advisors decide who is included from there. So for her, there's no agenda, okay? And as she says here, it's our job to reflect society, not to try and shape it. It's also, I think, worth noting that all entrants are then united by inclusion in the book, okay? This acts as a marker of consecration in its own right. So it both reflects, but it also then actively constructs in the world out there a widely recognised notional British elite. And actually this legitimacy has been underlined at various points in history in interesting ways. For example, during the Second World War, Winston Churchill personally intervened to ensure its publication was not affected by the paper shortage, regarding its circulation to be of national importance. Finally, just some quick information about the data. So, as I say, we have data here on every individual that was ever included in WhosWho since 1897. Gives us about 120,000 individuals. As I say, we're specifically interested in here on schools, universities and clubs. On schools, important to say, we distinguish here between four types of schooling. Okay, the 9 Clarendon Schools, as I've mentioned. We also look at a slightly wider group of 209 elite public schools that are collectively part of what's called the Headmasters' Conference. They make up about 2.5% of all pupils. We then look at all other private schools in the UK, and then finally any other type of school. In terms of universities, we're obviously focusing here on Oxford and Cambridge. That's for historical reasons. You know, they have traditionally been and continue to be arguably the most prestigious. And we're looking at private members' clubs, the majority of which have been male only and based here in London. And now, just to take you through the analysis, I'll pass you over to Aaron.
So, before going through the results in more detail, I want to kind of describe how we approach the analysis, because it's a little bit different from some other things that you may have seen in the past. Firstly, the main identifying piece of information that we have about individuals is the year in which they were born. And so we construct birth cohorts, and we use 5-year clusters to smooth out kind of any annual year-on-year fluctuation. So we look, for example, at 1830 to 1834, and then from 1835 to 1839. And this takes us all the way up to 1969. The reason that we stop here is because the people who are admitted to Who's Who tend to be slightly more mature. The average age of entry is around 50. And so we actually have very few people in Who's Who that are admitted after, who are born from kind of 1970 on. The cohorts vary in size. The smallest is about 1,400 individuals, and that's that very first cohort. Most have over 4,000 individuals, which gives us a sizable number of individuals with which to try and unpack these trends. One of the things analytically that we do is we estimate structural break tests. So according to Bai and Perron, the two economists that have generated this technique, it's particularly useful for looking at the effectiveness of particular policy changes. And so what it does is, if you take a time trend, what this technique will try to do is inductively discover any shifts or breaks in the data. So it's not us sort of saying and trying to test, is there a break around here? It kind of uses a search algorithm to identify those shifts and then tells us where those breaks occur. And it will give us both the date and the number of those breaks. And this can be quite useful because for Bai and Perron, we can then look at whether the dates at which these shifts or breaks occur coincide with the periods that we think are important in terms of certain policy shifts that are happening over this same period. And I'll talk more about the results here linked with that in a second. But first I want to kind of just lay out the big story here. Did the power of elite schools change over time? So this is the kind of first main graph of the paper, which is along the x-axis here we have those birth cohorts. So this is, remember, the year in which they were born. So if you were born in 1830, this means you may have been added to Who's Who kind of late in your life, around 1897, for example, and you would have been kind of nearly 70 years old at that point. And the same for those that are right at the end. Those are individuals who may have been added more recently, would be kind of 60. And on the vertical axis is the percentage of Who's Who of the people born in a specific birth cohort that attended different school types. So the black line here is the Clarendon Schools. And you'll note that at the very beginning of the period, in the middle of the 19th century, about 20% of each birth cohort attended a Clarendon school that ended up in Who's Who. By the end of that period, there's been a significant decline to about 8-9% of each of the cohorts that we have included.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Are you only looking at people who are born in the UK?
No, not at this point. This is everyone.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'll come back to this. The HMC schools, which includes the Clarendon schools, but is a much wider set, is this green line above here. And as we know historically, the number of these schools both expanded in size, but also increased their intake over this period. So we see a slight rise in the dominance of those, and they reach their peak at the kind of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But then also experience a decline to around about 30% for those cohorts born in the 1960s. The private schools in general follow that same pattern, but much less, it seems, dominant than these other two types, and we see, as you might expect, the kind of rise of other senior schools across this period. But it's important to note that this particular trend doesn't really say anything about the power of the schools, because this is just the who's who as a sample of elites in the population. We need to embed that in the wider population. And so what we try to do then is to estimate how big the advantage of the Clarendon schools is and whether this changes over time. And to do that, we situate this who's who sample within the broader population, and we use census data to do that. And we spent time, Sam and I, in the library here and in Oxford, going through archives to try and find the size of the Clarendon schools going right back to the 1830s onwards. And so what we can do then is kind of calculate the odds ratios of those that attended the Clarendon schools who end up in who's who, and we can compare those with everyone else in the population who also may have ended up in who's who but didn't go to one of these 9 schools. So if we look at the 1845-1849 cohort, we see that those that attended one of these 9 schools were 274 times more likely to end up in who's who than everyone else. This is a very large odds ratio. But if we move forward to the last cohort for which we have data, there's been a decline over this period. Now the odds ratio is around 67. So there has been a fall. But it's important to note that the size of the advantage that Clarendon School alumni face, even for these later cohorts, is still rather substantial. And I'm going to put that in some context a little bit later. But it does seem there's been a genuine fall in the power of these schools. And so this really raises the question of why did this happen? And we're going to kind of explore a couple of possible explanations here. The first one is perhaps this is something to do with the changing role of women within British society. Certainly, women would have had a very different set of opportunities in 1845 than they would have done for those born in 1960. And so it may be that as a larger share or a larger number of women have entered elite positions within British society, that this has diminished the propulsive power of the schools that over this period were male only. Some of them have become co-ed to some extent more recently, but over this period served males almost entirely. And so what we do here is just to kind of look at this trend, we sort of extract all the women from the sample and then plot those same trend for the Clarendon schools. And actually what we do is, to kind of answer your point, Abigail, we also exclude everyone that was born elsewhere. And this is the trend. I'm just going to show you the Clarendon graph. So the solid one is the solid black line is the observed trend that I showed you earlier. The dashed line is what that trend looks like if we cut out the women and all of those that are born elsewhere. And what you can see is that there's a slight rise in the number of Clarendon School alumni for those cohorts, but it's not explaining the majority of that fall. It's about 2 percentage points higher. So an important increase. So women have that kind of has played some role, but it's not the main thing that's driving this. And this is not entirely surprising. Even among the most recent cohorts, women constitute only around 25% of the people in Who's Who. And that change has only happened relatively recently, post-Second World War. But another possibility is changes in occupation. If we go back to the very beginning of this period, the military and religious leaders were a much more important, much larger share of the people that were included in Who's Who. Today, military leaders, religious leaders are far less common, and so there's been dramatic shifts in the occupational composition of the elite. And this too might be important, because if these Clarendon schools, as we have some evidence that they did, were closely tied to particular occupational trajectories, perhaps Clarendon schools were quite well known for sending their alumni into occupations that were linked to the empire, to the military more broadly, and that certainly reduced opportunities there. They may not have been able to find other opportunities in other sectors that have emerged or expanded over this same period. And so to explore this, we conduct kind of a counterfactual analysis. what we try to do is we say, what we can kind of make a set of assumptions and say, what would the world, what would Who's Who have looked like if certain things were the same? So here again is the kind of observed number of Clarendon Schools students, and the green line that's just kind of bouncing along with that and above it is the number of Clarendon School alumni that we would have seen in Who's Who if we assume that the occupational structure that existed right at the beginning of the sample was exactly the same at the end. So that is, there hadn't been a decline in the size of the military, there hadn't been a decline in the size of religious leaders. And again, this plays a role, but it seems to be a much more modest role than, for example, this top red line, which is what would have happened if the propulsive power of these schools had stayed the same. That is the capacity of these schools to propel their alumni into elite positions within British society. So there seems to be something about the school's ability to send their students onto or into elite trajectories that has changed. And so one of the possibilities that we propose is that this might be tied to educational reform, as Sam mentioned. And these are kind of the three major ones that we are interested in. They, as Sam mentioned, not only kind of radically democratized education, expanding access, but they also implemented a series of important changes to the nature of the credentials that they offered. So, for example, before the 1918 Fisher Act, the exams that students took to get into university were not standardised across schools. These were quite different from each other and actually often had very different content to them. This reform tried to bring some standardisation to those exams so that if you could see, you would know then that to pass meant something roughly similar across your local secondary school versus these Clarendon schools. And we argue that this standardisation makes, at least in principle, the students from your local secondary more comparable, not entirely comparable, but more comparable to the students that are coming out of these Clarendon schools. But they also did something else. They also began to differentiate. So again, at the very beginning of this period, what you received was a pass or a fail across all of the subjects. But these reforms started to change that. You started to get pass and fail for every individual subject that you took, and then, as we know, even more refined distinctions as we kind of started to get A's, B's and C's. And it then becomes possible to start distinguishing individuals. So the very good student from the local secondary school is now perhaps outperforming the kind of B student from Eton. And on paper, potentially, that makes a very different type of choice that evaluators are deciding, at least in terms of getting into university. So this is what, again, in terms of looking at those structural breaks, this is the kind of results from that part of the analysis. And here we can see the trajectory of the Clarendon schools. The shaded vertical bars are those cohorts that we expect to have been most affected by the introduction of these policies. So these are the cohorts that we would have expected to be the first ones to benefit from these particular changes. And when we run the structural break tests, these are the results that we get. We see a clear break at the beginning of the period. We sort of see this sharp decline, which then begins to flatten out. But the second, third and fourth break, as you can see, occur very much in the midst of these cohorts that we would anticipate that they would be affected by these particular policy changes. And so this suggests, at least, that these policy reforms may have played a role in undermining the power of these elite schools. And we see a similar result for the HMC schools also. We see, as we talked about, there's this kind of rise at the beginning, but there's a clear break for the Fisher Act and Education Act in the early parts, in the middle part of the 20th century. But it's also noteworthy that for both the HMC and the Clarendon schools, that the cohorts post-World War II have been much flatter. There hasn't been a kind of continual decline across that period. And so we wanted to try and unpack the persistence of these schools in the most recent period. And we can do this for the last part of the data. And what we can do here is not just look at the year in which you were born, but we can look at the year in which you were added to Who's Who. We only have that for the last period of the 21st century here. And what we do here is basically plot the same graphs, but now this is when you are added to Who's Who. And what you can see is that these lines are pretty flat. So over the last 16 years, it's not like we're seeing a steady decline of the influence of these schools, but actually any improvements, any kind of opening up of the elite that had occurred seems to have stalled somewhat. And so if we look at the sample of Who's Who now, the people that are just in it at the moment, how big is that advantage among current members? And again, putting that in the broader context of the entire population, we see that Clarendon School alumni are still 94 times more likely to be included in Who's Who than everyone else in the population. And just to kind of give this some context, when John Goldthorpe talks about social mobility in this country, he's described it as being unacceptably extreme. He's talking about people that are kind of comparing people that are born in the routine manual occupations and then make it to upper professional occupations. And the odds ratios we're talking about there are 6. So this is somewhere far beyond Goldthorpe's vision of unacceptably extreme in terms of the opportunities that these schools offer to their alumni. But Sam's also alluded to the importance of these other channels, the ways in which the alumni from these schools eventually make it into the elite. And I'm going to kind of break down this a little bit for universities and also clubs. And to do this, we do exactly the same type of thing that I've described already. But now what we're trying to do is not just look at the alumni from the Clarendon School, but then look at alumni from the Clarendon Schools who go to Oxbridge. We look at people that go to Oxbridge that didn't go to a Clarendon School. And we also look at the people that had the opportunity to go to both and try to calculate the odds ratios for those different groups. And this is broadly what we see. We've tried to do this for 2 groups, the kind of people that were in the book in Who's Who in 1910 and those that are in now. And so the baseline here are the people that have not been to either Clarendon Schools or Oxbridge. And what we do is we compare them to those 3 other categories. So here we have the people that attended Oxbridge but didn't go to a Clarendon School, people that attended a Clarendon School but didn't go to Oxbridge, and here the people that attended both. And I want to focus on that for a minute. So back in 1910, if you'd gone to both of those educational institutions, you were 300 times more likely to reach Who's Who than people who hadn't been to either of those institutions. Now there's been, again, we can see it even for this group, a substantial decline. It's practically halved over this period, which is still, I guess, some progress, but still a remarkable degree of kind of power that's associated with these 2 institutions. But, and I want to just draw attention to this, I think there's a really interesting kind of part of this story is that if we compare those, everyone that went to Oxbridge, and look at those that attended a Clarendon School before they went there and those that didn't, the kind of relative odds of attending are very different for these 2 groups. Going to Oxbridge, having gone to Clarendon first, almost doubles your likelihood of getting into Who's Who later in life. So Oxbridge isn't necessarily this kind of meritocratic clearinghouse that once you get into those 2 elite institutions, then everyone kind of shares an equal likelihood of reaching the elite. That actually these universities respond to the kind of habitus, the kind of cultural capital that you bring with you into that setting. Now the story for clubs is slightly different. We see, again, the kind of power of these institutions. It's not that they're unimportant, but actually what we see is that in the early part of this period, it's dominated by the school, not necessarily the club. And if anything, actually, going to a club without going to Clarendon Schools now has actually increased in its power. And part of the reason for this is that club membership in general has declined. But it's striking, I think, that club membership does seem to still be bound up with membership of the elite in some quite important ways. But what I want to really focus on is this. This was roughly the same number in the other slide too. This is the kind of direct, unmediated effect of the school, as Sam was talking about that doesn't go through these other elite institutions, and even these students have an exceptionally large chance of reaching Who's Who, even if they haven't gone to Oxbridge or Cambridge, or if they are not members of these clubs. The school is able to provide that additional advantage, even if you don't go through these other elite educational or social networks. And so I just want to briefly, before handing back over to Sam, I want to briefly reflect on what this says about the importance of the channels. So we've known for a long time that elite educational institutions, elite clubs play a role in elite formation and processes of elite recruitment. But what these have often missed is the duality within these institutions. Some individuals who attend Oxbridge are able to benefit or draw upon the advantages that those institutions offer to a greater extent than some others. And that simply arriving doesn't necessarily guarantee you access to elite positions within British society in the future. And so in this sense, we kind of echo Mills in saying that in terms of elite trajectories in the UK, there seems to be two types, one for old boys and one for everyone else.
Right, so I'm just going to try and finish now by reiterating some of these findings, and I think also maybe just try and discuss some of their implications and draw out the sort of meaning of these of this analysis. So I suppose really what we think we have here are two key results. First, as Aaron says, I think we show that the ability of Britain's elite schools to deliver elite destinations has declined very significantly, actually. And this is important, actually, because it helps to adjudicate to some extent between competing accounts, certainly in the sociological literature, on how elite schools have fared as the societies around them have undergone really quite radical structural change. So most recently, a number of elite scholars have argued that the power of these schools has actually remained remarkably persistent over time. In particular, the American scholar Seamus Khan has argued that actually elite schools have successfully maintained their advantage by enacting a sort of rhetorical sleight of hand, okay? Repositioning themselves skillfully not as upholders of ascribed social advantage, but as sites of meritocracy, admitting students based on individual educational attainment and excellence and hard work, and then propelling them on the same premise. This sort of what Khan calls the ruse of elite rhetoric obscures the ways in which he argues these schools continue to reward privilege. And I think for us, our results kind of support and problematise this account. So I think we would agree that deploying this rhetoric of meritocracy has successfully masked many of the functions of these elite schools. But it's also clear from these results that adaptation to structural change has not been seamless in the UK case. Okay, it's led to quite a meaningful decline in the power of these key elite institutions. And notably, as Aaron mentioned, we find that the most dramatic declines seem to have been following key educational reforms. Okay, and these are significant, as we argue, because they seem to both expand access to, but also standardise the form of the key credentials that are needed to actually oil elite trajectories. More specifically, I think we would argue that what these changes may have done is actually shift the symbolic power of a school in the Clarendon set, okay, from a generalised status marker to more an incubator of educational attainment. But actually in this new, more competitive environment, although elite schools have actually become very effective producers of educational excellence, okay, evidenced by their position in school league tables, their relative power is actually far weaker, okay, specifically from when in the past the school itself would have acted as a ticket, okay, it would have acted as a sort of unquestioned proxy for status. And I think maybe we can put this in slightly more facetious terms. And in this sense, it's perhaps worth invoking the well-known British TV comedy character Tim Nicebutdim. Now, for those of you that don't know, Tim Nicebutdim, Tim is an old boy, okay, in Harry Enfield's comic Guys, who gets on very much so in life, despite being demonstrably dim, and that's the joke, okay? And I suppose our point here then is that elite schools may no longer provide educationally less meritorious alumni, like Tim Nicebutdim, with the same guarantee of a future elite position. And I suppose to return to the point we made at the beginning, educational reform may well have failed to increase general aggregate rates of social mobility, but they do, in our analysis anyway, seem to have weakened certain inequality-generating institutions like elite schools. Now, this doesn't necessarily contradict work on social mobility, we would say. Old boys may well continue to readily reach the upper middle classes, but their ability to reach the very highest elite positions does seem to be significantly diminished. Or to put it more provocatively, whereas Tim Nicebutdim could have conceivably become a judge in 1960, he may only become a lawyer in 2016. But I think our second point really stresses very strongly that despite some weakening of these old boy recruitment channels, this is very much a story of persistence rather than terminal decay. Quite simply, elite schools remain extraordinarily successful. 94 times their alumni are 94 times more likely to take up an elite position than those attending other schools, and they're successful, as Aaron showed, even when they don't necessarily pass through these other elite institutions like Oxbridge or private members clubs. So how do we make sense of this? Well, I suppose here we would actually return to Seamus Khan and his insistence in his work that actually the meritocratic rhetoric of elite schools has obscured particularly the non-educational resources that continue to flow from these schools. Clearly, Britain's elite schools no longer engender the sort of antiquated style of the British gentleman, okay? But equally, they obviously do much more than just prime their students to achieve credentials. Indeed, I think following the work of someone like Louise Ashley in the UK, we would suggest that what the Clarendon Schools do very effectively today is cultivate broader, yet similarly gendered dispositions of what we might call polish, self-presentational polish, that actually then has currency across a range of occupational settings. Now, this polish can manifest in particular ways of speaking, particular ways of dressing, but also, as Seamus Khan writes, in diffuse ways of knowing. Okay, it's not what you learn in classes, but how you know it, Khan notes. So there's a sort of profound sense, perhaps, here that old boys feel they have the right to speak, in Bourdieu's terms, on almost any topic. And just to give you one illustration of what we're getting at here, we couldn't resist revisiting this picture from last summer, which shows 10 resourceful, frankly pretty audacious Eton schoolboys who somehow managed to broker a 2-hour meeting at the Kremlin to discuss world affairs with Vladimir Putin. Now, I think this kind of embodied polish doesn't necessarily guarantee an elite position, okay? But I think what we would suggest is that it clearly smooths a person's trajectory, okay? Especially in hyper-competitive, elite occupational settings where notions of cultural fit may be used to distinguish between candidates who are otherwise similar in terms of credentials, experience, etc. So I think while a reduction in elite recruitment from public schools is certainly noteworthy, it's important to situate this in the context of the continuing extreme relative advantage enjoyed by Britain's old boys. Thank you.
Stand or bring some chairs up?
Yeah, let's stand. I'll stand.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We've got nearly half an hour for questions and comments. Yeah, I think first.
Hi. A quick comment and a quick question, if I may.
Sure, yeah.
The comment was, thanks very much for a fantastic talk, by the way. The stagnation in the 2000s, the flat lines were also interesting. And one possibility there is that there was another break in what the schools were doing in, say, the late 70s and 80s. I don't know if you've read Ray's books around that time from where it was, Rugby. And basically arguing that this was the time when the schools had to, the public schools had to reform themselves. They were coming out of a period of 2 decades worth of potential attack, potential abolition by the Labour Party. And then suddenly they found themselves with all these direct grant schools joining their company. But also they realised that they were going to have to become more academic. And so one possible idea behind that flat lining is that actually they became a lot more academic and more selective. And so that they were, and we know this is the case, that they were delivering much more of an academic product, and academic credentials have become much more important. So they kind of cornered the market in academic credentials much more than in terms of other class credentials. So that would be my reading of that. My question of it is, it may be just a reflect of not fully understanding what you've presented so far, but in the WhosWho's data set, you've got all these elites, but what is the proportion of the population of that elite? Presumably, as the population is considerably larger than at the beginning, and yet there's only one prime minister at the beginning and at the end, so that the proportions of elites might have fallen. So does that affect your analysis? That's my question.
I'll take the last one, you do the first one.
Yeah.
So it's actually been remarkably stable as a proportion of the population. It's about 0.05%.
Yeah, right.
It was about 0.04% at the beginning, 0.05. So it's got slightly bigger, which is not kind of unexpected, I guess, given the kind of the expansion of the civil service, for example, and also the expansion of academia, which is kind of some of what's increasing there. So it actually, as a proportion of the population, it's pretty stable. And so even when we kind of try to redo our analysis, adjusting for fluctuations in the actual size of the entire sample, we get a pretty consistent story. That's fine. But thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to, I think it's a well taken comment about I think we obviously we're not necessarily able to document those sort of changes specifically, but I would agree. I think there's certainly what we were trying to get at is in that explanation towards the end there is this shift towards investing resources in incubating educational attainment, because educational attainment is the sort of certainly a sort of outward facing what these schools need to be doing in order to have a certain sort of meritocratic legitimacy, and they've been very successful at that. And if you look at league tables, they're up there. They're not necessarily the top 9 schools in the country, but they're very much up there. But I suppose I would still feel that if it was only that they were giving, then these odds ratios would be much lower, and as a result there's still something very profound that's coming through the schools that's non-educational, that's oiling the trajectories.
Which isn't true further down, by the way. Which isn't true further down, that in the upper middle classes. You can pretty well explain most of it by education, but obviously not at this end.
Yeah.
Yeah, great presentation. It's always good to be part of the cohort that you're studying. So I think I must be one of the youngest people who's here. I suppose you must have thought through this. Are there any alternative explanations for the trend, right? And you covered a few of them, and I think you may have covered it, but I just wanted to pose 3 possibilities. One, is it that the makeup of the schools, the Clarendon schools, has changed? So I'm conscious of the fact that the schools you talk about have become an international pipeline for elites. And I wondered whether some of the British elites are actually using some of the other very elite private schools, but just not the Clarendon ones. So there's a bit of displacement going on. So you might be creating leaders across the world, right? And I couldn't quite work out whether you take into account that. So that's one thing. The second thing is the Nicebutdim, they're now going into hedge funds, right? So they might not want to be in WhosWho. And again, I was trying to think through whether you'd taken that into account with your analysis, because as you well know, the nature of elites is changing. And so the Clarendon-Oxbridge route, I suspect, is going into the hedge funds are there for one, the financial elites rather than the more public elites from previous eras. Final thing, I would say, I do wonder whether you want to be known as a Clarendon School in Who's Who. So I do know some specific examples where people maybe aren't quite as proud as they were 50 years ago. So do you have a selection? So there's those three, but have you kind of thought of those?
Shall I take trend 1 and 3 and you do 2?
What was 2?
The hedge fund one.
Yeah.
Yep. So the point about the kind of internationalisation of these schools is a really great one. We can go back and look at some of the data for the HMC schools using the kind of Independent Schools Commission, which goes back to the late 70s. And at that point, these schools hadn't become as international as they are today. We can't go back further than that because they didn't collect the data. But assuming that they didn't kind of become international, then stop being international, and then go back to being international, I think we can kind of conservatively assume that that process hadn't happened yet. And so it's possible that it plays some role, but probably not as it's not one of the large drivers, we think, in terms of pushing that. But it's certainly, I think, if this follows for another 30, 40 years, that trend will be incredibly important. Yeah, absolutely. We absolutely, in writing this, we're quite careful to say, I think, that these are conservative estimates, because what we think is unlikely is that if you get to Who's Who and you didn't go to Eton, you're very unlikely to say that you did. But if you did go and don't want people to know that, you're much more likely to say, maybe I won't put that down. And so if anything, the bias in our estimates is downward. And so it's possible that the kind of change in who's reporting it creates some of the change that we're seeing here. That is possible. But we absolutely acknowledge that these are conservative estimates, probably across the board. But yeah, thank you. And then
I think yeah, and I think the second question is also really interesting, and I suppose gets at what we mean by elites, and is the sort of broader discussion. And I think Who's Who, as we mentioned, is good for getting at this sort of more public facing. Inherently, it's public facing, it's a public document, and it tries to sort of capture a whole range of occupational domains. But as you say, I mean, it may be that it's and some people have noted that it doesn't capture perhaps as well some types of elites that have particular economic power, and certainly also there's a methodological limitation in terms of the fact that people can refuse to be included. From our discussions with Who's Who, that's quite rare. That's in their terms, it's very rare that somebody refuses. There are some interesting historical ones. Arthur Scargill, for instance, refused to be included, but I think eventually
they forced him in.
They forced him in eventually, but I think that could be the case, that there are a range of very high-powered economic elites that are not in here that could be or should be. And I think there's an element for us in terms of wider work here, and we've discussed this with various people within LSE of trying to think a bit beyond Who's Who in terms of constructing an elite that takes measures from different types of sources.
Can I just make one quick? I think one of the other things to say about that is that the process is, at least the second and third process you described, would have been much more gradual in their impact, and so our ability to identify those clear breaks using that particular technique would suggest that there's something sharper that's driving at least part of that decline. So I think those things matter. I don't think it necessarily undermines the story we tell about educational reform.
Did you check anything against Wikipedia? So you could just check a sample.
Yeah,
we
actually
when they went to school in there.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that we sort of, as an extension, there's a whole bunch of things that we plan to do, and one of them is to use other sources of data to supplement the information, and we can use web scraping to try and capture some of that information. So, yeah.
Okay, got quite a few questions down at the back. Inside, yeah.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that. So I wanted to know much more about what actually happens inside the institutional channels, and I appreciate that's not a fair question because you haven't done that kind of quantitative research. But I was really interested in, Sam, your conclusion about the cultural polish thing, how it's a sort of cultural attitude that's being fostered and that sort of translates into increased access to elite positions. And I just wondered, first of all, if you can tell us a bit more about it, but also more specifically, given your interest in sort of longitudinal changes, is this something that's always been there? Has it always been the same? Is this something that has remained stable throughout
I mean, I think. I think that I should say two things on this. We're relying on other work we've done and other work other people have done in order to sort of come to these sorts of more suggestive conclusions about what's going on. I think a lot of the literature points towards this notion of the gentleman elite figure, and that was a particular embodied sort of formulation, and that it was actually quite important as a sort of a way of signalling your eliteness, and was responded to by gatekeepers in occupational domains who recognised one of their own, and was a means of sort of opportunity hoarding, if you will, and closure within the elite. And I suppose what we're sort of suggesting is that as the figure of the gentleman has morphed over time, but that the sort of more tacit embodied cultural capital, if you will, is still there, but it manifests, it is packaged in slightly different ways. And I suppose this concept of polish is one that's emerged from studies, including my own, that are looking at, for example, sort of elite senior figures in places like large professional service firms. And there, what's interesting is that what certainly I'm getting from research I've done with a big accountancy firm is that there is this sense in which sort of technical skills or technical knowledge can only get you so far, and then it's much more about a sort of a more presentational sense of who you are, that becomes very powerful for being, in the formulation of this accounting company, partner material. And so, but it's obviously quite hard to get at this stuff, particularly quantitatively. So it relies on qualitative work, it relies on ultimately probably participant observation, but certainly in my mind there's that sort of, I hope that sort of somewhat gets at what you're asking about.
Yeah, you with the glasses, yeah.
Thank you. Economists are very worried about causation now, and you seem to want to make quite strong causal claims. And so here's an artifact in Britain. The chance of getting admitted to Oxford with Cambridge varies by about 100 to 1, depending on what your first name is. We don't think that that's a causal influence. Right? That what people choose is actually then creating this. And so the puzzle then that comes up for these schools is, how do we know that they're actually playing a causal role, as opposed to just being a signifier of the kind of class background or other elements that these kids have, and that the schools themselves are actually playing any causal role?
Yeah.
Crucial question.
Yeah, I think that's something we are quite mindful of, and recognise some of the limitations of our data to be able to try and answer that particular question. So I would just say kind of maybe two things in response to that. We've done a bunch of supplementary analysis, which we kind of didn't report here, where we try to use alternative measures of class background. So we don't have the kind of traditional measures of where you come from to really try and parse out those types of processes. What we have are the titles, for example, of parents that are in WhosWho. So for instance, you might say, my parent who was a member of the British Academy. And we then use that as an identifier of being from probably a fairly elite, privileged social class position. And if we compare those groups, those that mention parents with that type of title and those that don't, we see almost exactly the same trajectory for those two groups of people. So we can't truly say whether this is kind of directly causal in that kind of identified cause and effect sense of the term, but we also see a quite consistent pattern across those two different groups where you might expect some variation. The other part of the thing that we have done is we've tried to use kind of more traditional kind of regression techniques, and also to kind of estimate Granger causal models to try and parse out whether it's actually kind of major education reforms that are driving this. And we use a bunch of proxies for that. So we measure education spending, the number of kids, the proportion of kids that are attending primary school, proportion of kids that are attending secondary school, the numbers in university, and then we adjust for a bunch of other covariates that we think might be important, and the results are almost entirely consistent with the story that we're telling, that the kind of expansion of education in all of those dimensions has played a role, or is at least correlated temporally with the decline that we're seeing. So I think we recognise that kind of our capacity to identify the causal effect with this data is limited, but we also recognise that doing everything that we think we can with the data, we see a stable story, and so I kind of trying to tell a compelling narrative at the same time. So I think hopefully that addresses at least some of the concerns. But it's a great question, thank you.
Abigail. Yeah.
Yes, well, I was going to make a similar point, that I actually think you're overestimating the impact of the institution. First, because there isn't a random sample of people who attend those institutions, and so you're going to have difficulty in terms of trying to identify the causal effect of them. And also you demonstrated to us that if you went to Oxbridge but you didn't go to one of these elite private schools, that the effect then was reduced. So in a sense you're showing us that it's not just to do with the institution, it's something else as well.
Sorry, you said the last point again?
Yes, because you showed us in one of the tables that if you went to Oxbridge but you hadn't gone to one of the elite private schools before, the effect then of being in WhosWho was reduced. So in a sense, you're showing, I mean, you were using that to say there's like a double effect of having elite education and an elite university education as well. But it does slightly disprove the power of these institutions. I'm not saying that there isn't an effect of these institutions. I think there is, but I think you might be overestimating their impact. I mean, you know, ideally you're trying to find somebody who could have gone, but whose parents chose not to send them, and see how well they get on as your comparison. But you know, it's difficult. You know, what you're showing is interesting, but just be a little bit careful about saying this is all to do with institutions, but it could be all to do with privilege. You know, if the upper classes all choose to send their children to these schools, the majority go on to Oxbridge, you're going to find them up in the top echelons of patients.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, it might not be nothing to do with the schools. They could have gone anywhere and still got there.
Yes, I think there's some truth to that, and I think the couple of points that I suppose we would respond to, partly the issues that we sort of mentioned already. I think we're never going to be able to find the kind of matched, right? I mean, like the threshold effect, that sort of discontinuity, that's not going to happen. I mean, in terms of the effect in the population, I think we are probably fairly close to that, in that the schools as a whole represent that group. Whether once you pass out origins, as we've talked about, that still persists. I think because of that decline that we're seeing, we think we're capturing the effective educational reform on that. I think we're getting close to that. Whether the schools are kind of adding something in addition to that would have to be something that we would be able to sort of pass out and more. We have some plans to do this where we're going to go back and try and we're in conversations with people to try and match in some other data about kind of affluence, etc., and then see whether those effects still hold. So, yeah, I think that's fair.
And I mean, yeah, just in a broad sense. I mean, I hope it didn't come across as us giving the impression that we think all of the sort of advantage that you're seeing in these statistics is entirely being driven by the years in which these children are at the institution. I think clearly, and that's, I suppose, the thing that we grapple with the most around WhosWho is that it isn't a normal social scientific data set. It doesn't have the measure of social origin, and that is a clear limitation. And clearly, in practice, the sort of advantage, particularly when we talk about this sort of non-educational polish or embodied cultural capital, you know, that is a formulation that, you know, is about primary socialisation. And I think the interesting thing here is probably thinking about these elite schools as being a more advanced form of secondary primary socialisation in a way than you might get from other types of schools, because of the structure of the school in terms of both the boarding school aspect as well as other aspects like extracurricular activities. But certainly there's a lot that's happening that's around the primary socialisation in particular families.
Well, I found very interesting the way in which you approach to the educational reforms carried out in England, because you said that those reforms just diminished the influence of the elites in not ended up with such influence. And my question is towards educational policy. Do you think that in the future we should be more focused on, for example, democratizing the access to higher education and be more focused on financing public universities like those based in London, for example, and that could drive a second punch on the information, because you can see also that in the same period as the educational reform was carried out, the expansion of capitalism is coincident with that. So what do you think that would be a policy projection for continue the process of diminishing of this elite construction, or do you think that there is a kind of non-reformable issue here? Is just about aristocracy and inheritance of power and wealth?
I'm not sure we even agree on this actually, so I don't know.
Big question and important. I mean, I suppose my little part on this would be.
We have the same problem back in Chile, so that's the reason.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a limit here to what appealing to sort of meritocratic style opening up type measures is going to ever do, and that's why, for me, the story of how these schools have retained their power and the story of the non-educational resources is so important, because I think, how much, certainly I would say these sort of shifts towards standardised credentials, it seems to me logical that would diminish some of the sort of Nicebutdims that have got in through the back door, etc. But whilst these schools have the incredible level of resource to cultivate other types of resources, and whilst those in positions of power still respond very clearly and still see those types of resources as legitimate, then to me the sort of meritocratic means to equalising is going to always be limited in its scope.
Time for just a couple more questions. Yes, couple more questions. Duncan, you've been trying to get there.
I was interested in when you were talking about the military and weeding the effect of that out. I'm thinking, well, there's other changes to the labour force, there's other changes to who's in who's who, and there's a lot more absolute number of people in who's who. So I was starting to think, well, is this that there's a greater proportion of who's who now given over to Stormzy's, if you like, but also that number thing, does that mean, or could it mean, that the people from the Clarendon Schools are occupying the upper echelons within who's who, and the people further down might be coming in from elsewhere, but are merely interesting but not powerful people?
Yes. So I think it's unlikely that people like Stormzy are dominating who's who now. And partly because they're quite, I mean, we kind of get this from, we kind of get this from the interview we had with Katie, which is that it's clear that they're not, influential to them is not celebrity. And so they might include England football captains, for example, but if you were going to be included as a sportsman, or you would need to have had a sort of sustained impact.
It's about sustainability. And
so people like Kate Moss are in, but she was much older when she got included than kind of when she was actually really at the peak of her fame.
Yeah.
So exactly, yeah. So people like that. So I think it's probably unlikely that that's driving some of the changes. Not. I mean, I'm sure it's had some effect, but unlikely that it's driving the majority of it. The question about whether there's a hierarchy within who's who is a really good one, and I think it's absolutely plausible that certain educational backgrounds cluster at certain positions within organisational hierarchies. They're certainly more dominant in certain fields than others. Yeah. So they're quite well represented in law, less well represented in MPs, I think. So I think that probably has played a role. It's not something we've really been able to unpack. We will be able to do it because we have the occupations, the specific roles in which people have. We can kind of parse some of that out, but we haven't done it yet. So I think that second thing is certainly more interesting to us. Yeah.
I'm going to be very, very random here because there's time for. Let's take 3 questions quickly together without answering, and then you can do wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Neil. So basically, I think just it's really interesting listening to all the discussion here. But the big takeaway from what you've done is this decline, right? Yep. And so what I thought was really exciting is that when you accounted for the change in the occupational structure of who's getting in, the decline looked less of a decline, right? That was what my read of that graph was. And then just on that last point about if you kind of can use those occupational categories of who's who to normalise your, let's face it, kind of really interesting but kind of odd sample, right? Yeah. That's getting the tail there. And you looked at, say, in the Nicebutdim sample, how powerful are the Clarendon Schools in getting their guys to be judges specifically, and what that looks over time. Yep. And I would put money that that's pretty much the same, right? I would say that's pretty much the same, and I think that's really interesting. But I think the more you normalise this, the more you account for things, you might move towards more stasis. But that's just what I would. My instinct would be whatever you find.
2 more quick questions, then we'll get some round up. Emma, yeah.
I'm really interested in the data that you might have for specific schools. I was thinking, wondering if you found ones have more propulsive power or decline in power to be more significant for certain schools, and why that might be.
Well, at the back, yeah. Tim, yeah.
Subgroup question. Did you look at clubs more and see if there's trends within club membership? If that's changing sort of subgroups within the elite, or new clubs rising to prominence, and things like that. I think it might tell an interesting story of what's happening within the school.
Okay, do you want to
wrap up? I'll be very quickly. Firstly, Neil, absolutely agree. Really good suggestion. We've done some work on that, but not as precise as the judges. So MPs, for example, was one of the kind of tracer groups that we've used that has experienced some decline. We also looked at the occupations that were routinely added rather than the more subjective element about influence, and that also experiences a decline. But looking precisely at some of those very elite positions is a great suggestion. So thank you. In terms of specific schools, we've done a little bit of that of the 9, and broadly speaking, it's kind of what you would expect. Sort of like Eton and Harrow dominate it. But they've all experienced a similar trajectory, though it's kind of moved in some, similar decline. But I think it's true to say that Eton and Harrow have experienced a relatively larger decline because they were much more powerful at the very beginning. And Tim, what was your question again? The clubs. So the club membership has declined a lot, actually, over the last sort of 100 years. And that presents a bit of a challenge. So the number of clubs has shrunk, and the size of the number of people that go to those clubs has also shrunk. But we're also relying on some kind of Whitaker's almanac data for that. The clubs don't give out their kind of rosters, if you like, or the numbers that they have, because they want to present. But there's an important trend. Do you want to say about this? I'll let you do the next.
Well, I don't know if you saw, there was an article, for instance, in the Observer this weekend about the rise of this sort of the new wave of London private members clubs, and I think the interesting question there is about whether who's going to those clubs, why, and whether or not you would include that in your entry if you're in Who's Who. We're not picking up on that here for all sorts of reasons, mainly just the age of the sample we're looking at. But I would imagine, certainly the way I look at London right now, there is a whole new breed of private members clubs where similar processes are taking place around careers being forged, but a lot of it more around sort of media, arts sectors in London.
Just very quickly on that, not a lot of people mention the newer clubs.
Yeah.
So we did try and identify those, and they don't come up all that much. It tends to be the classic ones that are talked about, at least in Who's Who.
Okay, I think we should stop there. Just to say, anyone who wants to read further, the article is coming out in the American Sociological Review sometime soon.
About a week and a half.
About a week, so it's going to be online pretty quickly. Thanks to you two. Thanks for the discussion. Hope to see you back here soon, all of you.